Good morning, everybody. You are welcome to my session. The topic of my presentation is China Must Explain, hashtag China Must Explain, a Twitter analysis of stigmatization of Africans in China. Unfortunately, we no longer have Twitter, so it's now X. But I believe everybody understands that. My name is Emeka Umejei. I'm a researcher, I'm a think tank, I'm an African too, yeah. So this analysis comes from a virtual campaign that was launched on Twitter when Africans who were living in Guangzhou, China, were expelled from their homes in the heat of COVID-19. So the outline here, I'm going to take you through, the meaning, like I've explained, of the hashtag, China Must Explain campaign and X. I looked at, broadly, I used a framework to analyze China-African relations called upstairs and the downstairs dimension. I will explain, and then the methodology and findings and conclusions. So China Must Explain, like I said, was a stigmatization of Africans living in China. They were thrown out of their homes at the time. And a Nigerian called Atyomi Fash started this virtual campaign on Twitter. And then it was appropriated by almost everybody around the world, up political leaders. But I was interested in looking at how African political actors, their messaging on this particular campaign on Twitter. So now I looked at the upstairs and the downstairs dimensions of China-African relations. The upstairs is the government-to-government segment of that engagement, which is quite appreciably buoyant, as we all know. So you have, political African government officials and Chinese government officials. The relationship in that segment is very, very, very positive. Now, but when we go to the downstairs of that segment, of that engagement, is very, very problematic, as we all know. In recent times, we have seen racial tensions. 2015 in Kenya, last year in Nigeria. We have seen recently a Chinese lover. Two incidents has happened in Nigeria in recent times. A Chinese lover killing their Nigerian lover. There's been issues of violation of local labor laws in certain African countries, and this whole tensions have resulted in problems in that segment. But for the first time in China-Africa relations, that expulsion of Africans living in Guangzhou over COVID-19 was the first time that the upstairs dimension of that engagement was actually ruptured. The first time African political actors, ministers, officials, came out in the open and criticized China for treating Africans, in a very, very deplorable manner. And for the first time, we saw, a collective response by African political actors and policymakers. We also saw, African policymakers and political actors also demanding compensation, for losses over COVID. We saw someone like Obi Ezekwesili, the former vice president of the World Bank, and the former minister in the Federal Republic of Nigeria going to court demanding for, reparation over COVID. We saw the finance minister of Ghana also going to court, but as we speak, all these things they've evaporated into the thin air as of now. The Kenyan Sunday Nation newspaper wrote an editorial and described it as betrayal of China-African friendship, and I could just read that here. I say, Kenya and the rest of Africa feel deeply betrayed by China. After standing together with the Asian country at its hour of need, when coronavirus ravaged and caused massive devastation, it is extremely shocking that Chinese people have now turned against Africans in their midst, evicting them from their rented homes and prohibiting them from shopping or going to public places. This was the height of it, So what did I do? Okay, my methodology. So I followed the event on X, or Twitter, so to speak. So I archived the tweets of political actors. And these political actors are grouped into 3 groups. We have opposition politicians in African countries. We have elected political actors. Then we have appointed political actors. Then I used what we call critical discourse analysis. I used Feklov's model. Feklov has a 3-dimensional model that applies discursive practice, textual analysis, and social practice. So I applied that to the text that I downloaded, that I archived, And so research questions: how did African political actors frame the China Must Explain campaign on X? What is the influence of the China Must Explain campaign on China-African relations? Because, like I said, this was the first time that the upstairs of that engagement was ruptured. It has never been ruptured before. It's always been very, very attractive and positive. And so I said we have 3 categories of political appointees. So the political appointees, we have Geoffrey Onyama, who used to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Nigeria. We had Sam Kutesa. I don't know if he's still the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Uganda. For opposition politicians, I followed Bobby Wine from Uganda, and Nelson Chamisa from Zimbabwe, and Miguna from Kenya. But for elected office holders, I followed the then Speaker of the Nigerian House of Reps, called Femi Gbajabiamila. Then these are some of the tweets. Unfortunately, I don't think I can, it's possible to read them here. It's very small here. I don't know how it is over there. But these are just the tweets that I collected over time, archived them and brought them out and then analyzed them. And then we could see, maybe I can read the one from the Ugandan Minister for Foreign Affairs, Honorable Sam Kutesa, saying, "This morning I met with His Excellency Zeng Zuxiang, please forgive me, the Chinese ambassador to Uganda. The minister called on the government of China to urgently intervene and address the plight of Ugandans in China." Then here we go, the minister from Nigeria saying Nigeria has again registered its concern and displeasure to the Chinese government and stated emphatically that is unacceptable. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever to completely trespass on the rights and dignity of Nigerians and Africans. Now, the dynamic is here. In the first meeting that Geoffrey Onyema had with the Chinese ambassador, the language was very, very, very condescending. He was like, he was appealing. I could still read it. It says, I invited the Chinese ambassador to Nigeria, Mr. Zhou Pingyong, to communicate Nigerians' government extreme concern on allegations of maltreatment of Nigerians in Guangzhou, China, and called for immediate Chinese government intervention. So we could see a discourse of intervention by political appointees. Then we move to opposition politicians. I will read the tweet of Nelson Chamisa. The treatment of Africans in China must be respectful of human rights. Africans must be accorded the same respect the Chinese get in Africa. A full investigation must be launched into the reported cases of abuse, and the AU must engage China in defense of African citizens. Miguna, also the Kenyan opposition politician, said, I support the campaign by the United Content of Africa movement, calling on all Africans, wherever they are, to boycott of Chinese restaurants and to stop buying or eating Chinese food until the Republic of China publicly condemns and stops all anti-African racism and practices. Then we go again. Then this is Musi Maimane. Okay, I added Musi Maimane from South Africa. And he's saying, this is really painful to watch. The African Union must take action to help our African brothers and sisters who are living and working in China. We must take a clear stand as a continent. Then Bobby Wine from Kenya and from Uganda said, we call on the government of China to ensure that the Africans in China are treated with the same respect as with the Chinese people living in Africa, and that their human rights are respected. When I looked at the messaging of Nigerian speaker, the then speaker, who is currently the chief of staff to the Nigerian president, Femi Gbajabiamila, he was involved in what we could call performative politics. He was more interested in making Nigerians see that, I've intervened, I have the interest of Nigeria at heart. I have the interest of Nigerians living in China at heart. But that was where it ended, There was no follow-up action. After he met with the Chinese ambassador, and then he ended there. But it won him some form of political capital among Nigerians who felt like, oh, this is our man, he stood out for us when we were being oppressed in China. He spoke, outrightly for the Nigerian people, but in the long run, it was mostly performative. Now, what is the finding? The finding, what I found was that the appointed political office holders, that means the ministers of foreign affairs, were asking China to intervene, in a situation that was created by China. So I was wondering, instead of taking a decisive stand to say, okay, this is what we want your government to do, and ensure that Africans are not maltreated in China, the elected officials were asking for the intervention of China. Now, but when you look at it, it will seem as if it just happened unconsciously, or it just happened maybe just like that. But it's a kind of discourse, the draw on discourse of, foreign intervention, So the political elites are used to, foreign intervention from China, from other, global powers, in terms of foreign aid, in terms of, funding for infrastructure. So they are drawing on a known discourse. They're not, because discourse is, both constitutive and, constructive. So you don't go out of your discourse, So you draw on a discourse that is very, very, that is available to you. So they're drawing on a very, very known discourse to them. Now, when you go to the opposition politicians, you see them talking about human rights, political, pluralism, freedom of information, they are also drawing on, a discourse that is also relevant to their own contextual lived reality in Africa. I mean, for instance, in Uganda, Bobby Wine has been arrested often, and then, so it's been the issue of he's been repressed, he's suffered oppression. So he looks at the event through his own discourse, his own lived reality, and say, oh, why not, we must enforce this respect for African people. Then when you look to the normal elected political officer in Nigeria, he's always thinking about the next, in Nigeria and Africa, he's always thinking about the next election. So he's always involved in performative politics, He wants the people to see that he's working, that he has the interest of the people at heart. And you see also that same discourse is what Femi Bajabamila was also drawing on, making Nigerians see that he has invited the Chinese ambassador. But that was where it ended. There was no action. There was nothing. There was no follow-up, unlike even the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And then the question is, what is the implication for China-Africa relations? As I say here, even though this is not very clear, unfortunately it's not clear, but as I say here, it is evident that the racial stigmatization of Africans living in China over COVID-19 will not cause much damage to China-African relations. And why? There could be a talk, which we saw, in recent times, but in China-African relations, as evidenced by press statement and messaging of African political actors and policymakers. But that's where it will end. African political actors are still beholden to China for trade and development aid throughout much of the African continent, and this is where the problem lies, because most African political actors, they accept whatever comes from the PRC, even though it doesn't favor the continent, but because they're thinking of, funding, development assistance, financial assistance, funding for infrastructure projects. So it becomes, would I call it hamstrung, or so to speak, to act in the interest of the African people. And then you ask yourself, why is it that there's not even an African-wide policy of engaging with the PRC in Africa? There's none, unfortunately. I remember, when I finished my master's in 2013, this was one of my suggestions. Why is it that as of 2010, China has an African policy, but the African continent, I don't think, has a clear-cut policy for engaging with Africa. So there's kind of a disparate engagement with China by individual African countries. So there's no power, there's no strength in individual engagement. So this is my conclusion, and I'm open to questions if there's any. But if there's none, they're good. Okay.
Yeah, just going to On the very last point that you said,
Yeah.
Doctor, about Africa's white paper for China, now that China prefers bilateral relations, would you prefer that paper to be an African Union paper or individual African countries crafting a white paper on China?
No, I think when it's African-wide, if it's African Union, it has more power because it's collective, you know. But if it's bilateral, it becomes susceptible to manipulations because then you can manipulate the individual country based on their needs and wants, you know. But if it's, you know, if it's a collective bargain, you have more power, you know, to negotiate at the table. But I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, thank you for that very interesting presentation. I'm wondering, has that hashtag and the campaign been used in other situations, especially post-COVID? And I ask partly because, you know, a number of the governments that you're talking about were very strong, appropriately strong supporters, for example, at the UN Human Rights Council on initiatives looking globally at the effects of anti-Black racism. But I also am curious to know whether it's used as certain Chinese social media platforms, particularly on the Chinese internet, which is to a large extent closed off from the outside on platforms like Douyin and Bilibili. You know, even now you can find shocking, horrifically anti-Black racist commentary on a regular basis, you know, on platforms over which state censors exercise a lot of control. And so if there was a political decision made to remove that content, the state certainly has the capacity to do so. So I just wonder if this hashtag or the campaign has been used in other circumstances. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I didn't check elsewhere. I was focused on Twitter. So it is possible, I don't know, but I don't have any evidence, but I didn't check there. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, to follow up on the previous question, that might be a recommendation because we've also been hearing over the past 2 days of issues with, you know, Chinese mining practices. I mean, there are so many, you know, the opaque debt loans, et cetera, that are happening across the continent. And is there the possibility of perhaps reviving this hashtag to beyond just the COVID-19 to start calling out some of the human rights abuses or other issues that are causing havoc across the continent by the People's Republic of China? Is that something that could be a possibility?
Sure, that's definitely a possibility. But you know, I wouldn't do that, right? So if the civil society is active, you know, because one of the issues that we have here is that in the civil society space in Africa, there seems to be so much lack of awareness of the PRC's violations, you know, PRC's engagement in Africa, that sometimes you just ask yourself, where is the civil society? So instead of the civil society, it is even the academic, you know, the scholars who are picking up some of these things. So the civil society is very, 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 I don't want to use the word redundant, but they're not active in that space when it comes to China-Africa relations, you know. Civil society is not active. It's always been scholars who pick up these issues, who analyze, and even as scholars, when you analyze and you publish, civil society also goes down, you know. So it becomes problematic. So if the civil society takes it up, fine. But as a scholar and a researcher, I don't think it's in my place to do so. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So actually a comment, this was a very interesting presentation, and following up on, I forget our friend here, I also find it interesting to have observed how newcomers from China, let's say in Kenya where I'm from, how they behave when they're very, very new, and how their behavior changes over time. Now, in what way do I mean? I had a conversation with someone here who has lived in China and who has studied China deeply, and his opinion was that the Chinese are given a perspective of the world that almost takes away from the humanity of the citizens of the rest of the world. Now, specifically, what I understood was a Chinese will meet someone foreign and ask, and maybe in 20 minutes figure out that, hey, okay, you have the same emotions as I do, you have similar aspirations, your mother also cries when you leave and is happy when you come home. And now what I've seen at home, now back in Kenya, is in the beginning, the Chinese and the locals, the Chinese will be very, quite hostile. And then after a few months, you know, they'll dating locals and this sort of thing. So I just wanted to throw that comment in as just an interesting aside into what could be going on when the Chinese in China on those platforms are expressed very, like our friend said, very maybe concerning, very anti-African or views. Maybe part of it, maybe for the government, it's a good distraction. Just get people talking about anything else other than, yeah, what's going on in China. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, two questions for you. So first, could you talk a little bit more about how this sort of episode was covered in local media in African countries? Like, is this something that was sort of part of like a larger public discourse here on the continent? Like, were people talking about this, upset about this, and sort of how big of a deal was it, sort of? And then second, do you have a sense of sort of if and how this affected like migration flows more largely? Like, did this, you know, sway people in terms of like, you know, African students not wanting to go study in China anymore, like people that had to come back during the pandemic not wanting to return to China for business or for education? Thank you.
Yeah, I think in terms of the media, it gained traction in the media, but it was not very, very much. Remember that there's a lot of media engagement that the PRC has in Africa. So maybe one or two, because I mean ministers were involved, you know. So the political actors spoke, and then it was published in the media, and that was where it ended. I mean, the issues that we have here is follow-up. So there was no follow-up. I mean, it was that first time it became news. It was a big hit, and then it died off again, and then that's just it. In terms of African students returning back to China, that's a different ballgame entirely. I think it goes because there are issues of opportunities, you know, and people are looking for opportunities. And then if they find opportunities in China, they go for it. So I think that's where the problem is. Yeah, it's a kind of a bargain. It's an economic transaction. So if China offers opportunity to you, and you're looking for a scholarship to do a master's or a PhD, they will go. Yeah, thank you. Is there someone over there?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to come in and also give in my opinion. It's just going to be a comment based on my experience living and studying in China for 2 years. I did my master's in China, and you know, part of the issues that we were dealing with was, of course, racism. So I wanted to join this conversation by just giving in a few thoughts. First is that at some point in China, we had a really serious racist scenario that was actually involving a provincial authority in Guangzhou, where they made a public notice that said they were not welcoming African visitors in rentals and stuff like that. So it's not a new thing as such. The COVID one, of course, was one of the extreme cases, but I wanted to point out that, yeah, in China, it's just something that's really embedded in, you know, in the local governance as well. And I think also part of the issue from the China side is that from my interactions, it seems to appear that the Chinese community or society for a very long time has been enclosed and, with very limited interaction with the outside world. And I remember one of my professors actually said when we were talking about African Chinese kids in Guangzhou, and how they cannot get legal immigration status, and she was like, in our society, if you're not born Chinese, you'll not be Chinese, so you'll have to seek for your citizenship, in the African country where one of your parents is from. So I just wanted to point out that institutional sort of aspect, but also just the cultural issue that is deeply rooted in the Chinese society. It's obviously one of the challenges that the Chinese government faces while it expands its influence on the African continent. And for sure, as you pointed out, the civil society has very limited leverage or avenues to change things, and it's good if politicians from the African side are, coming out to like make bold statements. I think those go a long way. I also saw the African Union made a similar statement. So that is a high-level sort of comment that the Chinese government would obviously take seriously. Thank you.
Thank you.